So this may shock a few of my friends who are in the audience, but I was actually an academic peer advisor at NYU. And as such, I used to advise students on who the best professors were. This was before the internet, where you could just look it up. And someone who came up, number one, most of the time was Bill Silber, just a tremendous educator, teacher. I can't say enough about how much I learned in that class. And equally, I can't say enough about Bob Akeson. So we started having live events. I joined the management committee of this group when COVID kicked in. And so you can imagine how hard it is to keep an organization together that's built around live events during COVID. And Bob Akeson just did a tremendous job with podcasts, which continue, with being a team player, with being a professional. So I really want to thank you, Bob. I thought it was really great, and I really look forward to your interaction with Bill Silber. I'm going to tell an urban legend now, okay? So I grew up on trading floors, okay? And on trading floors, there are a lot of urban legends. And the one urban legend that always sort of resonated with me was the airport trade. And for those of you who've never heard of the airport trade, it goes something like this. There's a prop trader, he's up against his limits, his boss has been yelling at him for a month, telling him he's gonna fire him. He calls his broker, he puts on a position, he gets in a taxi, he goes to the airport. When he gets to the airport, he calls to see if the position's in his favor. If it's in his favor, he goes back to the office. If it's not in his favor, he gets on the plane. And so, in a way, that's a Hail Mary, and in a way, that's an embedded, what do we call it, Professor? An embedded asymmetric option?
Something like that. That sounds good.
Now I'm going to hand it over to Bob Akeson, and thank you all for coming.
So, Dan, thank you first of all for your kind words, and welcome everyone. The roundtable is extremely pleased and honored to have Professor William Silber join us tonight, and with the professor's permission, I'll address him going forward as Bill. Bill, of course, was, as Dan said, a professor at New York University. In fact, he was the former Marcus Nadler Professor of Economics and Finance at NYU's Stern School of Business, and a three-time winner of the Professor of the Year at Stern, which is a big deal. In addition, Bill has served as a senior economist with the President's Council of Economic Advisors and as a member of the Economic Advisory Panel of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He's also the author of 8 books. Now, I've read 3 of them. I didn't know you had another 5. So we're here tonight.
I'm gonna hold that against you.
Not on my score, right? My grades. So this is the book we're here to talk about tonight. But I also want to call everyone's attention to another book, which I would heartily recommend for anyone that's interested in understanding how it was that the U.S. dollar was able to become the world's reserve currency. I'll say it that way. This is a fabulous book. It's called When Washington Shut Wall Street Down, so I would really recommend you take a look at that. In addition, he was an options trader. I'd love to hear something about that, Bill, on the New York Mercantile Exchange. And of course, tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the power of nothing to lose. And I hope all of you were able to get the free books that we have out front, so make sure you do before we go. We're absolutely sure that you're going to find Bill's comments and insights to be of great interest. Kunjan was kind enough to thank our sponsors. I do want to say to the audience here, Bill and I will be having a conversation. And I would encourage everyone in the audience, in as much as you have questions or would like clarification on points, to please jump in. I think Bill likes the rough and tumble of the classroom. So by all means, please feel free to jump in. So let's get to it, though. You've had a very distinguished career in academia, at one of the world's leading business schools. You've written books, as we talked about. Tell us about the book. Tell us about The Power of Nothing to Lose. Why did you write the book, and what are some of the relevant themes in the book?
Well, before I tell you why I wrote the book, how about if I tell you a story? Can I start?
Please.
Can I start with the story?
Absolutely.
Anybody?
Pull that microphone a little closer.
So, I have a good friend who's a mathematician. He's also a numerologist.
Oh.
So he has this mystical attachment to numbers. And one Saturday night, he's partying, you know how the mathematicians are, right? Goes to sleep Sunday night, 1 o'clock in the morning, sets the alarm for 6 a.m. Boom, hits the pillow, he's out. Next morning, he bolts out of bed, and he looks at the clock. It says 55:55. That's okay. Fives are starting to get his attention. Gets dressed, gets into the car, is about to put the key into the ignition. He looks at the odometer. It says 55,555.55 miles. Now fives are really bouncing in. Gets to work. He's not in there for more than a minute, and his secretary comes in, a meeting in room 5 in 5 minutes. He decides to take the rest of the day off, goes to the bank, withdraws $5,000, goes to the track, goes up to window number 5, puts $5,000 on number 5 in the 5th race. And would you believe the horse comes in 5th? I don't know what you expected. So it's all about expectations.
Yes.
What does this have to do with the book? Well, the book says The Power of Nothing to Lose. And it's really something that I've been thinking about for 30 years while I'm teaching my course in investments. The course in investments is about numbers, of course, and it's how do you choose among stocks, bonds, real estate, and so on, conditions under uncertainty. And I quickly realized that those same principles that influence an investor making decisions are the same principles that presidents, generals, and ordinary people use when they are confronted with uncertainty. And what I finally picked out as the most important decision people have to make is that when you have downside protection, when you don't have to worry about downside, you tend to take reckless decisions. And there's no better example of that than Aaron Rodgers. Smart guy, right? At least until now, when he chose to go to the Jets.
I guess you're not a Jets fan.
I am a Jets fan, but unfortunately,
It's a great movie.
it may work out. Don't count your chickens yet. And Rodgers doesn't throw interceptions. He doesn't throw interceptions except towards the end of the game, when they're losing by less than a touchdown. He throws his signature Hail Mary. Why? Big upside. He can win the game. What's his downside? Another meaningless interception. And what I did is I took that idea and worked it into my class. At the end of the semester, when people are saying, why isn't it ending yet? I wanted to get their attention. So I created a contest. I said, I'm going to give you a list of 10 financial assets. 10-year treasury bond, S&P 500, Apple stock, crude oil, and so on. If you pick the one that has the highest return in the last month of class, you'll get 1.5 points added to your final exam grade. The average grading class was 12, so 1.5 is a lot. So they look at that and they say, how should I choose? How should I choose among those 10 assets? Well, a whole bunch of them start doing spreadsheets and Excel spreadsheet. Imagine today they do a chat GPT with somebody. But the clever ones quickly recognize that this has the same features as a Hail Mary. How is that? 1.5 points if you pick the highest outcome. And if you pick the worst, nothing happens, even though maybe something should. Nothing happens. You have what? Downside protection. So how do you choose? The answer is you choose the asset that has the biggest variance. The more variance, the better. Why is that? Because bigger variance gives you big upside. Well, what about the downside? Who cares? I don't lose anything. And of course, those of you who are familiar with options realize that this is the exact same principle underlying why options on the most volatile asset have the highest premium. So people who have downside protection tend to take big risks that often give the big payoff to the decider, the person who's making the decision, but often produce collateral damage, and we can talk about the collateral damage.
So that's a very interesting insight, Professor. How powerful is this downside protection?
Did any of you watch the Squid Game on Netflix? Who watched the Squid Game? Don't be embarrassed. Those people say, how could you watch that nonsense, right? It's the Squid Game. Squid Game, this was 2 years ago, right? And they just announced they're going to have season 2 of the Squid Game. So I'm going to remind you of what the Squid Game was. It was based on South Koreans who were heavily indebted, and they were offered to participate in a game, in an arena, where they had children's games, like red light, green light, 1, 2, 3, whatever happens after that. You have to stop. And in this game, the winners continued. The losers were slaughtered. And the participants, after that first event where they saw their people who kept on moving after the red light, they were dead. They were offered the opportunity to go away and not participate anymore. So they all went away, and believe it or not, they all started to come back. And they willingly participated in a game where the losers were slaughtered. Why is that? Because there was a prize-winning money that was life-changing. And they saw the opportunity for a life-changing event. And the alternative was what? They would get killed. But their life was so disappointing that they chose to risk their lives in order to get this big upside because their life was so terrible otherwise. The reviewers panned it. Okay? Many people wouldn't want to look at this picture. It was gruesome. I show in this book that numerous real-world examples occur with people ready to risk everything, to risk their lives in order for a perceived big payoff. The best example is asylum seekers on the high seas risking death To do what? To enter a country where they think they will have great opportunity. Suicide bombers. What do? They risk their life for immortality, and by comparison, their current existence is trivial, big upside. And the most important, not the most important, but a classic historical example is generals at war. Hitler, at the end of World War II, in December of 1944, engaged in something called the Battle of the Bulge. Anybody see the movie? It was a great movie. It was an old movie. It was a great movie. Battle of the Bulge was, the war was already lost. Hitler's generals already told him, you might as well give up. This was after D-Day. And in December of 1944, Hitler engaged in a reckless offensive in order to push through American and British troops in order to get to Antwerp. Antwerp was a port which the Allies were using, and it was a reckless decision. Every general said no, and he said, I'm going to do it. Why is that? The war is already lost. I have nothing to lose by doing what? Risking everything. And in fact, the collateral damage in that case was the greatest deaths among Allied forces. So for the general, for Hitler, he had nothing to lose.
And Americans in particular, as I remember.
Americans had the greatest. And there was a huge, murder of American POWs at Malmedy in Belgium. This was a tremendous, so the collateral damage of that nothing to lose decision was huge.
You know, Professor, when you talk about the Battle of the Bulge, and Battle of the Bulge being a good example of the
power of nothing to lose, yes.
Okay. What I also thought was interesting, you made the following point in the book, that Hitler, in Hitler's mind, he had nothing to lose. But the generals surrounding him felt they did have something to lose. They didn't want to be swinging from the hangman's noose. They didn't want to see necessarily further carnage inflicted on their fellow countrymen. But Hitler himself felt he had nothing to lose.
Well, Hitler himself had felt nothing to lose, and Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister, in fact turned something that FDR said in that war, during the war, to convince the normal German soldiers that they had nothing to lose. In a meeting in 1943 with FDR and Churchill, the first meeting, FDR said, we're going to battle, and there's going to be unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender. And Goebbels, in fact, told Hitler, I could not imagine getting a better theme. Every German soldier will now fight to the death because they think that they will be murdered anyway if the Allies win because of unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender is very popular, and it came from Ulysses Grant. But when he said unconditional surrender, he in fact let the Southern troops go home with their guns and their horses. So unconditional, every surrender has conditions. You have to be careful about giving your enemy nothing to lose.
And Professor, if you could,
You want-
I'm sorry, please.
Sure.
Question.
Just a quick question. Do you think that also ties in with the Russia-Ukraine war? Because for Russia, it's just another land it can acquire, but for Ukraine, it's their whole country.
Yeah.
And everyone thought, oh, this is in the bag for them. They're going to have the superiority land, air. But that's not the case. They're fumbling the bag here. So is that also tie into Ukraine has nothing to lose? They have everything to lose.
I think that's a reasonable point. That the Ukraine, relative, I mean, it's not quite the same. It's not quite the same, but Ukraine has almost nothing to lose by fighting to the death, because otherwise they will be subjugated. So I think that's a reasonable.
But they were subjugated before.
Say it again.
They were subjugated before.
Before, when it went under the Soviet Union.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough.
Now, Bill, in the book you give several other examples, which I think may be worth talking about very briefly. One being the actions of lame duck presidents. Okay, and I think that President Clinton, as you tell in the book, took advantage of his status as a lame duck to pardon someone, an infamous individual, in fact, that many in the room might remember, Mark Rich, right? You also mentioned Rosa Parks as an example. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Well, let me first talk a little bit about, so again, it's collateral damage. So, I mean, it's not so insightful to say, if you have nothing to lose, you're really going to throw caution to the wind and make a great effort. That's common sense, although in the book, I think I point out cases that you would not normally think have that characteristic, the same characteristic as a Hail Mary, by the way. So you don't mind if I bring up another one, but you'll remind me of what I'm supposed to talk about. So we all saw Washington crossing the Delaware. We've all seen that picture, isn't that right?
We have, yes.
I mean, it's a classic. It was a Hail Mary.
Oh, yeah.
A Hail Mary. Washington wrote to his cousin at Mount Vernon, if we don't win a battle now, all my troops are going to disappear. They're going to go back for the getting ready for the spring harvest, and I might as well do something that will at least give me a chance. And the chance was to attack when it was all against his odds. Why? He had nothing to lose. So things that we're familiar with have this nothing to lose, Hail Mary dimension to them. You mentioned, yeah.
I have a question, Bill.
Sure.
Relative to Silicon Valley Bank, when the government said they're going to backstop all these accounts, not just moral hazard, what kind of Hail Mary?
Well, look, all right, so did I tell you to raise this point because I wrote it? Are you sure? I don't remember. You know, it's hard. I had a hip surgery 2 months ago, and maybe I forgot things before. So I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal in March that pointed out that, I asked the question, how did the three biggest executives at Silicon Valley Bank get 18 million in bonus the year before while they were sitting on a powder keg of losses? Of course, the answer is they were able to take advantage of legally, and there was nothing illegal about what they did. Take advantage legally of the held to maturity account. What does that mean? They could buy government bonds, and if they said they intended to hold it to maturity, they would put it into the hold to maturity account. And if it's put into the hold to maturity account, capital gains and losses are ignored. Why is that? Because when you get to maturity, you're going to get par no matter what. There won't be any gains or losses. However, the coupon income of those bonds goes into the income statement, padding the income statement. Therefore, what? You have upside with no downside, and that promoted, I'm going to say do a technical term rather than moving out on the yield curve. They went way out on the yield curve. Why is that? Because you might as well buy a 10-year, a 10-year or a 20-year government bond. Why is that? You got a bigger coupon, and you don't care about the losses anyway. So Silicon Valley Bank, in fact, had a Hail Mary. They had nothing to lose. And by the way, since you brought it up, we know traders in general have asymmetric payoffs. Why is that? They get a bonus if they make money, and what happens if they lose? It's the bank's money.
Yep.
Oh, so he said, well, they can get fired. They'll go to another bank. They all do. Howie, what was his name? Howie.
Friedman?
No. He's in there.
Reuben?
Great mortgage trader.
Reuben.
Yeah.
Howie Rubin, right? Howie Rubin, great mortgage trader at Solomon Brothers. Went to Merrill. Merrill gave him an explicit fraction of the profits. Okay? So what did he do? He bought 400 million, who knows how many mortgages. They lost money. He put them in the drawer and lost $400 million, which may not sound like a lot of money today, but in 1987 was the biggest loss on Wall Street at the time. So what happened? He got fired from Merrill. 2 years later, Bear Stearns hires Howie. Why? Because he knows how to take risk. So you really have to be very, these are examples of what? Hail Mary. These are examples of downside protection, whose benefits accrue to the decider, but cause collateral damage. And it's the collateral damage that has, I'm a conservative, so I'll say social goods. They are social goods. They demand government intervention, or at least peer intervention.
So just to go back to the Rubin case,
Yes.
situation. Rubin joined Solomon in '82, and he earned $25 million.
For Solomon, no, that was for Solomon. He only got $1 million.
That's what I'm about to say. And that's how he got lured away,
Yes,
according
by
to
Merrill.
you, by Merrill. And he loses $45 million in '85, 2 years later. His trading performance improved, but did not prevent a $250 million loss in '87. That's the point at which he leaves the firm and goes to Bear Stearns and makes the mortgage group $150 million.
Yeah, he was a great risk taker.
It was someone else's money.
That's correct.
OPM, right? All good. Could we just, sure, yes?
So I did not have the benefit of reading the book, but
I won't hold that against you until about a month from now.
I'll be done in a couple of days. So in the case of Silicon Valley, the guys who blew up the bank were also equity holders. So their equity went to zero. So they did have something to lose, right? And I'm on the marketing side of finance, but I've seen a lot of alts funds. And I don't know if your analysis applies to that, but some of the worst meltdowns have to do with managers who are invested in their programs, and it almost seems to be an emotional thing when they start to, something happens that causes them to override the risk controls. The managers, they just turn off the system, and then they start taking bets. And I've seen that time and again. And it's almost emotionally driven because there's, at least with the concept of you have nothing to lose, so let's hope that makes sense. But I don't know if those scenarios can be explained by holding records.
I'm not quite sure about, what I was referring to was the CEO and the two, whatever they were. I don't know what their equity interests were in the bank, so I can't tell you. But I think you're correct. To the extent that they had an equity interest, they did have something to lose. So the question is, how much was the upside of a bonus versus what fraction of their equity would have? So I don't know the answer. But your point would be correct, that they would have something to lose to the extent that they had equity.
Yes, sir.
So I just
Speak up, please.
Yeah, so I have a quick question there. So are you saying that the systems that are supposed to prevent this phenomenon don't work? So Aaron Rodgers, his coach doesn't tell him not to throw a Hail Mary at the end of the game, or the government. So pretty much there's no solution to this.
Oh, okay. So you say. So what are there solutions to? Are there solutions to fixing the asymmetric payoff?
Yeah, from the checks and balances.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The only thing I would not say is the coach doesn't tell Aaron Rodgers anything. And the coach would tell him, at the end of the game. But in general, he doesn't tell him anything. So there are ways to offset asymmetric payoffs, making them symmetric, sort of symmetric. So in the case of traders, you could say you're on salary and your bonus doesn't depend upon how much you make. Now you may lose a lot of traders, okay? And one of the problems with the banks who know full well this asymmetry, one of the problems is they too want the upside. They also want the upside, okay? And the downside, they'll say, the government's going to come in and bail me out of here. You can make the payoffs more symmetric. And you mentioned checks and balances. Every trading desk has a manager. What's the manager's job to do? Look over the trader's shoulder to make sure they didn't hide trades in the desk like Howie Rubin. And they're not taking undue risks. So I'm going to have to come. I was a trader. I traded on the floor of the futures exchange. And my clearinghouse demanded good faith deposit. So they are the ones who represented to other traders that I would make good on my whatever trades I had. And this, by the way, was in the days when I was on the futures exchange. And there was screaming. Anybody see Trading Places?
Yes.
That's the best movie you ever made, right? You got to see it. Okay? And what went on in that movie is exactly what goes on the trading floor. Chaos. And yet, throughout the trading day, my clearing firm would come and look at my cards to see whether I have exceeded my limits. So managers do the same. Managers do the same. Look, is it right on managers? Or
Finish your thought.
Okay. So there's one other example I can give you. So there's a whole chapter in this book on prison violence. And the question is, who are the most violent criminals? The ones who have nothing to lose. Life without parole prisoners. What do they have to lose? You give them another life sentence? So the anecdotal evidence, you always see, you have headlines, life without parole criminal X stab somebody 43 times. They make headlines. So the normal instinct is life without parole inmates have nothing to lose. And I saw this discussion of somebody on the front page of the New York Post who stabbed an inmate and so on and so forth. A careful study of prison violence shows just the opposite. Life without parole prisoners have the same record of misbehavior. There are obviously individuals, but the life without parole have the same level of misbehavior. The ones who tend to be the most violent are the ones who have very short stays, 5 years, not life. What's going on? How's that possible? So the answer is life without parole prisoners have a lot to lose because prison is their home forever, and they want privileges. They want to be trustees. They want to be able to get an air-conditioned cell, and therefore they have something to lose. Whereas the short-timers say, look, what is it going to be? What, they're going to punish me? I'll be out of here in a year. Therefore, I might as well do whatever I wanted to do. So it's an interesting, here's a case where you would think they have nothing to lose, but when you look at the fine grains of what's going on, they have so giving someone who has, now if they didn't have any privileges, okay? If the life without parole prisoners had no privileges, well, they certainly, I would think, be more likely to misbehave than otherwise. So giving them something to lose. I'll give you, go ahead, now you go.
Go ahead, John.
So, in line with David's question, at what point is corporate oversight more important or less important than like the regulatory body coming in and sort of saying, hey, from your economist perspective?
Look, when I was younger, and idealistic, I would have said, yeah, turn it over to the regulators. Regulators are almost always too far behind. They're always playing catch up. I mean, you show me a good regulator. He was a trader 10 years ago, but now, everything's different. So I'm not saying regulations play no role. I'm going to give you proprietary trading. So I wrote a biography of Paul Volcker. Volcker, what's a
It's a good book, then.
whatever it is. Volcker. I got it
That's all you need to know.
That's right. And you may know. I mean, now people know Volcker because of inflation. But before inflation, before 2020, 2021, people knew the Volcker rule.
Mm-hmm.
What's the Volcker rule? No proprietary trading. You only can do market making.
If you're a bank.
If you're a bank. So I was writing the biography when the Volcker rule was being formulated. And I was asked by a number of people, what do you think of the Volcker rule? I said, it probably plays some role. After all, there are capital requirements of banks that tend to provide a buffer, but they're not perfect. So you have another dimension here because, if capital was enough, but how much capital is enough? The answer is that's never enough, right? So they said, yeah, but proprietary traders, their interests are aligned with bank management. Why is it they too want the upside? I said, all you need is to give them enough to lose. What does that mean? I guarantee you that if you told Jamie Dimon he would face 20 years in prison if any of his traders were proprietary trading, there would be zero no proprietary trading. He said, well, that's ridiculous. I said, yeah, okay, so that's why you don't have perfect control, because there's a balance.
What's that?
I don't know. Follow? Did I answer
well
that?
said. Well said.
Yeah. Matthew?
Yeah, just a general question. Would you say that betting against mortgage bonds back in 2008 was a Hail Mary by hedge funds?
Just repeat it slowly.
Sorry, betting against mortgage bonds in 2008, that was more of a Hail Mary?
Betting against mortgage bonds in 2008,
Yeah.
was that a Hail Mary?
Would you say that was a Hail Mary?
It's not quite clear to me that it is, but I'm ready to listen. I don't see it
You don't see it.
as, I mean, when you're talking about Paulson,
Michael Burry's hedge fund.
yeah, I don't think that if you take a big position with your own money, you have a lot to lose.
Interesting.
You have a lot to lose. Now, to the extent every leveraged corporation can be viewed as an option on the assets of the firm. And therefore, they have some downside protection. They can't, the payoffs are not symmetric. I have literally unlimited upside, but if I've borrowed money, at some point I can say, here, you take the firm, it's not worth anything, and all I lose is what I promised the bondholders. So there is an element of Hail Mary, of downside protection in every corporate structure that's leveraged.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Well, I guess that on that point, Bill, you could say that the fractional reserve financial system that we have is ripe for this type of risk taking.
Look, I'm reading a biography that's being written by someone that's going to come out very soon, a biography of Milton Friedman. And they want a blurb.
Sure.
So Friedman, for the longest time, had a Chicago school recommendation to have 100% reserve requirements. What does that mean? If you want to take in demand deposits, you have to hold 100% reserves. This, in my mind, we talked about this along I feel sorry for him, he had to drive me here. Where was I?
Reserve requirements.
Requirements.
It's almost like a money market mutual fund, almost, okay? Because money market mutual funds, as long as they don't go beyond 3 months, effectively are 100% reserve. So fractional reserve system by its nature has asymmetric payoffs. It's another example of anytime you are leveraged. And banks are, of course, leveraged by more than any other institution, which, by the way, is why they're regulated. Okay? Why are banks regulated? Why don't you regulate hedge funds? The answer is they're risking their money. The hedge funds shouldn't be regulated. Banks have to be because they have a huge incentive to take bigger risks than they're entitled to.
Well, isn't that why we call non-bank financial services companies, they've been dubbed shadow banks? Because they perform many of the same functions that a deposit-taking institution performs, except they don't take deposits.
Yeah, but they do have collateral damage to other institutions that think they look like banks. So I wouldn't say that they...
You mean the shadow banks?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know what's interesting is when this book, which you wrote in 2007, right, the reserve requirements
When I
for
was
you were a young man,
22.
yes, 22.
Yeah.
So at this time, the reserve requirement for banks was 25%. When you wrote this book, it's 10%, right? So we've become even more leveraged. And I guess what the pundits would say, the experts would say, the regulators would say, is that we have more refined risk management tools. Would you agree with that?
I think we have more risk management tools. I mean, I don't know what capital requirements were. I really don't know.
Well, you wrote it's 25%.
That's reserve requirements as opposed to capital.
Yes, reserve requirements.
Those are reserve requirements, but not capital requirements.
And keeping in mind too, when during World War I, that was pre-Glass-Steagall, so commercial banks and investment banks, retail institutions could be housed under one roof, as they can be today. But of course, from the mid-30s through '99, they were separated as a result of Glass-Steagall.
Yes, that's correct. It's an A on the midterm.
A plus, come on. So, I'm sorry, please.
Here's a young man who hasn't said anything yet.
Yeah, another young man.
Right.
So, I think you possibly describe the use of the Fed put as another sort of Hail Mary tool. Do you see any benefit to the Fed put in that context?
Well, when you say a benefit to the Fed put, we are
but
so far on the benefits.
This is from a policy perspective. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know to what extent there really is a Fed put. In the sense that the Fed must intervene to prevent a large decline. I think let's be clear of what I mean by what I mean by the Fed put. The Fed has the stock market on its radar screen and will not allow the stock market to drop by more than X%. That's what I think about the Fed put, as opposed to the economy as a whole, because clearly the job of the Fed is to prevent the economy from collapsing. So, for example, I would not call the Fed's intervention in March of 2020 a Fed put. I would not call it a Fed put, because there I think there was a legitimate concern that the financial structure was at risk, as opposed to the stock market goes down, stock market goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, and I don't think, quote unquote, normal declines. Now you can go back. You and I were around in '87, correct? Most of the other people they don't know what we're talking about. So in '80, yeah, you read about '87? So 1987, when the stock market declined by 21%, Greenspan said, we're going to open up liquidity, but liquidity was designed to help people make payments on securities that they lost money on, but had enough capital that they could, but the clearinghouses, the problem then was clearinghouses. The clearinghouse wasn't able to collect the other side. So that was, again, I have to be very, very, when you say the Fed put, I think the stock market, and I don't think the Federal Reserve would say stocks can't decline by 50% this year. By the way, in 2007, from 2008 to 2009, it declined by 50%.
But isn't it a function of what people or investors think rather than the actual reality. So they behave.
Oh, and so they take more risks.
They take more risks.
Yeah, no. Yeah, on that you're 100% correct. Yes, yes. And by the way, this is, I'm going to bring up a name where I don't think anybody's heard of him, because I knew him, but he was considered a crank. Hyman Minsky.
Oh, sure. The Minsky effect.
The Minsky effect. The Minsky effect is, unless you let people suffer the consequence of losses, they will take too much risk and you'll have a bigger loss. This is the Minsky effect. And by the way, it has more truth to it than many other laws that we pay attention to today. It's the Minsky effect. You must let them scrape their knee and hurt. Now, the problem is, it sounds almost like, what's his name, and who was the secretary, Hoover's secretary of the Treasury?
Mellon. Andrew Mellon.
Let them liquidate everything, liquidate. They won't learn a lesson unless you liquidate, and they lose a lot of money. So, Minsky, he was almost a communist, I want you to know.
But that could also have a systemic effect. In other words, if there was a decline in the market, people took undue risk, and there wasn't a policy intervention, I mean, that could have a much broader effect on the economy.
Well, it could.
Yes, sir.
Central banking is an art, not a science.
Yes.
Somebody who didn't have a question.
He's next in the queue.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
We'll get you next, right?
I was gonna ask. So, everyone in here, we're all primarily involved in finance and economics and the whole spectrum. Outside of that, though, like, what are some natural examples? Because we could all identify half a dozen situations where we see these Hail Marys in our own firms and kind of everything else. But to really understand kind of the gist of what you're trying to say, what are some examples outside of finance and economics and politics where
what else is there besides finance, economics, and politics?
The right answer is you got to tell them to buy the book. Buy the book. It's in the book, right?
No. So we already talked about two.
Yeah.
We talked about war, right? And we talked about prisons, right? I'll give you two more that are in the book. Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, who didn't give up her seat. She says, I had nothing to lose. I had nothing to lose. I'd go to jail, but I can't take the racial discrimination. And that triggered the bus boycott, that triggered the rise of Martin Luther King, because she said, I'm not getting off the bus. Why? It's in the first page of the chapter. I have nothing to lose. And I actually overworked that phrase by getting a whole bunch of people in who were part of that, the Montgomery bus boycott that led to the civil rights movement.
And Bill, what about Louis Washkansky?
Yeah, I don't want to talk about it.
No.
You want to talk? You can talk about it. No. Louis Washkansky was the first open-hearted surgeon, and he had nothing to lose. And the reason I don't want to talk about medicine, it gets complicated. I can talk about medicine. There's a chapter in medicine in there. All right, I'll talk about it. People who are facing fatal illnesses have nothing to lose by trying experimental treatments. And that gets lots of publicity. And there's every reason for someone who is in that situation to look for experimental treatments. However, it may not be in the public interest for the country as a whole to divert resources to those people who have nothing to lose. There may be a triage. We know if you put somebody in a bed in an intensive care unit, somebody else who and they are fatal and they are on their deathbed. That bed has a huge opportunity cost. Somebody else can't use it. And moreover, the President of the United States should not say try an experimental drug because you have nothing to lose, because he has to think about something like, how about funding the search for new antibiotics, which have a huge potential for saving many, many more lives, but no specific company ready to risk so many millions of dollars for such an amorphous benefit.
So who should make that decision?
The president has to make that decision.
The president of the United States?
The Congress.
Okay.
Whoever, who's in charge? I don't know.
We're conservative.
Who is in charge? Because there are, I'm a conservative, but these are public goods. Public goods have a very broad benefit that nobody can capture in order to sell it to you, like national defense. The government must do that, okay? So those things, ready? Preparing for the next pandemic. Who's doing that? You think anybody? No, nobody that I know of. Why? Because the benefits are too far in the future and amorphous. And yet, should we be doing it? Sure. We should have, and this is in the book, silos throughout the United States next to the nuclear, maybe instead of the nuclear ones, filled with N95 masks.
Yeah.
Well, what's the cost of that?
Yes.
Is it nothing? What's the potential benefit? Can you calculate it?
No. Bill, you make some very interesting points, and in the remaining time that we have, I know we have a question from this side of the room.
Sure. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, so in this case of like, you have nothing to lose, but you still have this big upside. I guess I go to the metaphor of chess. If a grandmaster is playing a game, you can still be a couple moves before the checkmate, but if you truly have nothing to lose, you resign. Whereas, like, if you have that upside, that opportunity risk, doesn't that count as something, especially when you're downside protected, doesn't that count as something that you could lose?
Sure. If I'm 3 moves away, I'm going to lose anyway. I'm going to do something crazy. I'll take my pawn. I'll give up my queen to your pawn. I don't know. Why not? You'll be so confused. Maybe I'll be able to do something after.
But I feel like a chess grandmaster at that point there's still an opportunity to maybe.
You tell them to read the book.
Read the book.
No, that's the chess grandmaster.
Bill Silber, I want to say thank you on behalf of the New York Alternative Investment Roundtable. Our time is about up. Are there any other questions before we turn it over to BJ? Yes, sir.
In the case of prison violence that you mentioned earlier, so the guy that has the life sentence with privileges clearly has something to lose, so he's not going to be the one to do bad things. But the guy with the shorter sentence, how does he not have anything to lose? Can't he be resentenced if he kills someone, assaults a guard? Instead of being there for a year, he's there for 10 years. Why would he be more likely to be bad?
Yeah, well, it depends on what kind of misbehavior. So in other words, if he kills a guard, obviously he has something to lose.
He's not a short timer anymore.
Yeah, but if he refuses to eat, unless, again, you have to see what counted as misbehavior.
And not everyone acts rationally, right? I mean, we all think we're acting rationally.
And by the way, this isn't every single person in this group.
Sure. Anything else? Bill, thank you. Bill Silber,
Pleasure. Nice to be here. You all had very good questions.